we gathered together in our mini men's group to discuss gender issues. And as I see my views, not everyone's, I thought I would start with some background in order that my perspective could be better understood. So in the house where I grew up, a sorority met regularly. Once a week, my house was a sorority house. From my dad, I had special instructions in the proper expression of emotion, on love in relationships, and other emotional issues. And from my mother, I learned how to learn tools, especially the hammer, the saw, the screwdriver, repair electrical appliances, do electronics, and of course to do mathematical proofs. After I left home through the tube to go to college, in short time I was married, even though I didn't believe in marriage on the mountain or anything like that. It was already, I think, for the 1950s, a kind of a new model of marriage. And we did have 2 children, and eventually, in time, in the 60s, developed into a so-called extended family, or hippie commune, with a large number of people in many different kinds of relationships. It was in this particular phase of a family that the breakup occurred. I became single more or less in the middle of my psychedelic period. And then there followed a period of, I would say, psychedelic exploration of gender issues. I refer to this period myself as a kind of experimental mathematics, Pythagorean numerology, as it were. And then suddenly I was in India, living in a cave, and had my first experience of an extended celibacy. That's more or less my story. After that, I returned to California, and this was the time, this is post-60s now. The next thing that is happening is feminism, the women's movement, women's issues, and following a couple of years, men's issues. Then I was in a men's group of straight men, and I hated this group because their approach to gender issues explored, exaggerated, and firmed up and evolved differences, to me fictitious gender differences, tradition in the culture which they were affirming and reinforcing. So then I moved to another men's group, a gay men's group, there to find a different view of gender differences. But no, indeed, this particular group of gay men had the same gender stereotypes as the straight group, and maybe even worse. So I'd like to start with a hypothesis for the sake of triaphony, because I know this is not everyone's view, but I think it will help us to put gender issues in illuminated perspective, to make this assumption for the sake of discussion, not in a regional perspective of mine, but well known under the name androgyny. In this view, a person's soul, as it were, does not necessarily share the gender restriction of the biological body, and in the course of one incarnation experiences a kind of a piecewise development, the goal of which would be the exposure of a complete person. And along this path of development, there are various repressions take place, where part of the person is repressed according to some role models, gender-based differences and so on, which may be fictitious or less than mythological or cultural, social, as opposed to fundamental aspects of the structure of the soul. So the progress toward this completeness of a person, of an androgynous development, is hindered by social practices which emphasize the the difference between the genders, as if all what is possible to a man is what is encoded in the physical body. So this is hypothesis one, androgyny, as a perspective for the discussion of gender issues altogether. Now, what are these issues? Gender issues. There are dozens of books over these past 20 years defining one and then another and then another. Just as an example of one that I have been personally involved with in a fairly deep way is the gender issues in ability to do and to learn mathematics. And there, again, without realizing that this was part of a bigger program on my part, I took, for the sake of research, the position that there were no gender differences for learning mathematics. And perhaps little girls were taught that they couldn't do mathematics. My hypothesis had to do with visual mathematics and the fact that visual representation is needed to learn mathematics, and there may be a gender difference in the emotional response to a situation where mathematics is presented to be learned without the pictures, and therefore could not be learned, and how you respond to this impossibility, or being scolded for not learning what you can't possibly learn. That response might be gender biased. Anyway, our list of issues, I think, shouldn't proceed on this level of microscopic detail. So I look in some current books for some categories of main gender issues. And in one recent book on men's issues by man, by, I guess, a traditional cultural man, we are told that there are three main areas in the initiation of a boy into the male model, and they are war, work, and sex. So I'm willing to acknowledge that there are gender differences in war. This may be important to know that if you want to stop the war that you're waged primarily by men, at least during these past 6,000 years that we have historical records. In the workplace, we know there are differences in roles, goals, expectations for work between the genders that are obviously cultural, and they're on the rapid decline, and women are achieving equal opportunity in the workplace, even if not equal pay. And in sex, it seems, on the basis of my own research during my psychedelic period, I think that the difference between the genders in the approaching sexual experience is totally fictitious and is not based at all on biology, the shape of the body, or anything like that. Just expectations that are easily exceeded through exploration of the maximum potential for sexual experience that people of either gender could achieve essentially identical experience. So with these issues we can approach from the hypothesis of androgyny and make some kind of analysis. But I'm not satisfied with this list of issues, because I feel, here we are approaching axiom 2, that the inner core of gender difference in our culture is encoded in the structure of the nuclear family. So if we wanted to limit the discussion to the most important issues among gender issues, then I propose this is another hypothesis, just to accept for the sake of discussion this hypothesis that the central core of gender issues is in the nuclear family. And there we can examine them, because we all came from nuclear families and recently live in nuclear families with a housemate, children, and so on. So in the nuclear family, accepting the hypothesis of androgyny, there we could suppose that a change in structure in the nuclear family would enable men and women to achieve their maximum androgynous potential somehow developing within the family. And there has been in the past decade a lot of progress in this direction, which, according to these two hypotheses then, is fundamentally important, represents a very fundamental change in the structure of society. That is, that women work. Now 40% of mothers are employed. And also men share in the housework, child rearing, and co-parenting. So I'm thinking that these are very fundamental and important changes. But at the same time, we see that marriage is decreasingly successful, at least in its stability and long-range persistence. And the nuclear family structure could actually be lost through its failure to accommodate these very important changes of the mother and father approaching androgyny, balance, or symmetry in the relationship. So in terms of saving the world, I'm proposing to examine the microscopy of the destabilization of the nuclear family through the increase of balance and partnership within it. Ideally, we would like to have a social structure that was fair, where there was a balanced partnership of the genders, and at the same time provided the people living in it with happiness and the children with maximum potential for growth and so on. I don't think that we've had that now. But this is, I think, is a core problem. And it could be, since we're in the middle of a major phase change in the structure of society, which has been unchanged for thousands of years, that there are different backlash and reflexive reactions to these movements from which we suffer. Or it could be that these stresses and difficulties in marriage are incurable, and that nuclear family is obsolete practice on the way to the dust heap, and will be replaced by a revival of a tribal organization or some other extended family, community, or village structure where children are around in bands. I don't know. But if the partnership of people would be to survive, I think that there are two issues that have to be studied, and problems that must be mastered. One is as women seek equal pay in the marketplace, so much must men seek equal pay in the household. So I'm proposing here a bookkeeping system for families, for households, where an hour of work in the kitchen or the garden or at the office would receive points on the accounts, and that whether people were striving for equality, that is a 50-50 partnership or whatever, at least that they would get credited for what they do, because I think that there is a misperception, there's kind of a backlash in that women are reacting against 6,000 years of enslavement and oppression, and now under the banner of women's liberation are in some cases throwing over most of their responsibilities in the family in a way to make up for lost time. And men, feeling guilty for the crimes of men over the past 6,000 years, are accepting at the same time a disproportionate share of duties, along with the lack of any credit for doing them. So this is like a very small offering to the altar of the survival of the family, and as a bookkeeping system for a time, just to give feedback to the participants in their actual share. And each member of a household could keep their own accounts, and annually there would be a meeting with some external auditors or something, mediators, to iron out the differences, just as it exactly happens with corporations and limited partnerships in the business world. The other issue, I think, besides accounting and fair pay, that needs to be addressed is the question of monogamy and jealousy. Now, in extended families and hippie communes in the 1960s, since they were large groups, pair bonds or sexual addictions between different members would change from time to time without threatening the stability of the home. People just moved from one room to another, essentially. And we saw then, and I think people have always seen, what Wilhelm Reich called voluntary monogamy. There's voluntary monogamy and obligatory monogamy. Voluntary monogamy, according to Reich, is a natural phase of the human species and has a natural lifetime of about 5 years, he thought. Whereas obligatory monogamy, contractual monogamy, is an imposed state according to agreement, a contract that's been signed. And according to Reich, this agreement always produces inversion, he called it, of the participants, in a situation in which love turns to hate and resentment grows. So I think a stabilizing factor within nuclear families or extended families would be an enhanced understanding of the mechanism of jealousy as a disease, as an aspect of an agreement not working, a contractual monogamy agreement not working, and as a disease needs a treatment. Now, if we get a cold, we don't go to a doctor. Maybe we just take aspirin. But if we get flu with a fever, then we go to a doctor. In spite of the fact that the flu with fever is going to cure itself in about 3 to 5 days even without the doctor. However, when we get a very serious emotional disease, one that can have life-threatening consequences like jealousy, then we don't have anyone to go to. So I think in order for this, one of the main reasons in my experience that families have exploded in the past, we would need to have an improved understanding of these emotional diseases and treatments for them, and the social climate in which it was encouraged rather than discouraged to seek help when any one of these various, I'm no expert in emotional diseases in relationship, but I'm just recommending this perspective. So here are two really, I think, small offerings on the altar of salvation of the nuclear family, and I'm not even personally committed to salvation of the nuclear family, but I think until we have discovered an alternative, that we want this one to work long enough that children have an opportunity for a happy and secure childhood in which they can develop the foundation for the rest of their life.
Can I ask you I basically agree with most of what you're saying. I want to ask some questions. A simple question. How old are you now?
Yes, right, good question. I'm 55. That means when my family stopped, when the psychedelic experiments stopped, when I returned to California and became a single person and so on, was essentially 20 years ago, a time when many people we knew were just heading off for college.
And then the other things that I was interested in, your advocacy of androgyny. How do you imagine, if this were generally taken up and accepted, how do you imagine it would impact on the behavior of women? And the second question, how would it impact on the notion of monogamy? Does androgyny mean to you bisexuality? And if it does, then do you imagine people would have monogamous relationships but with two people at a time, and then that would be called monogamy?
I think that androgyny means that there is no such thing as a man and a woman. The very question of a binary polarity in the psyche between the masculine side and the feminine side, the yin and the yang, and the symbol of them entwined, that even that is questionable. This is just a model. Once you look at the full system, it could be that it doesn't even have any natural polarities as, let's say, a biological cell would have. So you look at a battery and you see the positive electrode and the negative electrode. We think of this as a binary, and we ignore the fact that within the battery are these parallel plates where there's a microscopic increase of electrical potential between one pole and the other. I think that there would be no difference, really, from a developed male and a developed female.
So monogamy would still mean...
would manifest emotions, would have force, would be able to do this, would suppress that, would have the weakness that's manifesting workaholism, would go to war. All of the strengths and all of the weaknesses of all men and all women would be within the spectrum of behaviors of any person. When two people, no matter the gender, and join in a sexual partnership that's an interesting experiment, then they might fall on them a natural state of voluntary monogamy, where they don't want to have this kind of experience with other people because it detracts from the intensity of the knowledge that I don't know what. Let's say such thing happens, it wouldn't matter the gender. What would matter, which is, I think, is very important for understanding the variety of sexual behavior around the world. They would have, in their sexual experience, a kind of balance of power. They would be experimenting in balance instead of making perverse profit over a strong disparity of power.
So people would still have relations in the Reichian model of serial monogamy. It's just that it might be a man, it might be a woman, and the idea would be to sort of not notice. The point being...
Even if people were dedicated to the heterosexual model, and many people are, particularly like as far as on the mammalian physiology side, that there is some side of complementarity which is fascinating. Even then, that the roles of positive, negative, top, bottom, active, passive, all of these things could be traded, no matter that one is always a man, the other always, it doesn't even matter. The physical gender doesn't even matter to androgynes.
And then this question, how would androgyny change the behavior of women?
Well, women in becoming androgynes would add on new aspects, capabilities, and forces without losing any, just as men would fulfill their maximum potential by adding on and not necessarily losing. For example, we now have a phenomenon, the subject of many books, in which men and women exchange roles, as it were. Men become passive in order to absolve the guilt of being too active in the past. So androgynes don't do that. They're active on Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and passive on Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday or something.
Well, I guess what I'm trying to get at is, it seems to me if this were to come into general acceptance, it would change male behavior a lot and female behavior not much.
Well, a lot, because then women would be doing whatever they don't do now.
But what is that?
Well, women have already gained, you mean?
Yes, and that the bipolar roles of the sexes which you're talking about have been largely throughout history maintained by men anyway, and women have sort of seemed to be rather indifferent to that whole issue.
I don't know. As I understand your proposition here, is that in the recent past, women have made more progress to androgyny than men. Men have either retained their traditional maleness, or they've swapped it out for some traditional femaleness. And I don't have enough social experience in the last 20 years to check that out. I think somewhere there must be some androgynous men on the rise in the younger generation.
But what seems to have happened is that the men make a fairly distinct choice to either remain heterosexual or become gay, and that this balancing on the edge and trying to fuse these polarities has not been viewed as a male option in the same way that...
Well, there's a tremendous number of bisexual men and bisexual women, and always has been. Maybe the numbers on the rise now, I'm not sure, but the awareness of this is on the rise because there's a bisexual rights movement.
Well, that was my point, is we're just inundated with the needs and demands of the gay movement, men and women. This is the first time I've ever heard the phrase bisexual rights movement.
Well, the latest thing happening, I'm happy for once to bring some novelty actually from the street, from the corridors of social revolution here into our Trialogue. There is a bisexual rights movement, and and you see, bisexuals have been rejected by heterosexuals and by gays as well, and especially in these days of AIDS, you know, bisexuals are carrying a tremendous burden of guilt in that they are the ones who are bringing, I mean, according to this myth, bisexuals are bringing AIDS from homosexual men to the heterosexual community. So, and AIDS is on the tremendous rise in the heterosexual community worldwide, and that could be the way. Although the other theory about the IV is more likely. Not to confuse, however, bisexuality and androgyny. Androgyny is a state of completeness somehow in your psychological makeup.
And bisexuality is a behavior.
Is a behavior which could be pursued with or without androgyny. Mm-hmm. I think that bisexuality for some people, and certainly for me, has been a kind of laboratory in which to evolve the concept of androgyny in a way that exists in my mind, which I'm unfortunately not really able to verbalize. But it's been a factor, but I don't think it's an essential root. Straight people can definitely become totally androgynous, and probably that's the way it will happen for most people. I think I have great hopes for the rise of bisexuality, but they've been dashed by AIDS. People must unfortunately pursue their psychological development outside the sexual laboratory.
And do you see celibacy as an expression of either androgyny or bisexuality, or is it of a... Let's say something about that.
Celibacy is the best possible laboratory for, I believe. I mean, I don't believe much. It's unfashionable for us to believe anything, and we don't believe much, you know, but I do believe that celibacy is the best possible laboratory for personal development. There, I've said it. Celibate rights movement. When I first went to India, and I was coming out of this laboratory period in Europe, my intention was to study tantric sexual groups all over India by joining them and learning their methods. That's not what happened. Instead, I became celibate, was living in a cave, and so on. Another thing that happened that I really didn't expect, never heard of, never dreamt of, was that I became silent. Muni, they call it, a Muni Baba, a silent yogi, like Baba Haridas in California. From this, it's analogous to celibacy, you see. When you're not speaking, you do hang around in social places, you walk down the street to get your groceries or whatever, and you listen, and you hear everybody talking, and since you're not talking, you can hear it in a completely different way. You hear that everybody was talking only to attract somebody of the opposite gender, or to get a job, or to advertise their services in the marketplace, or to project their ego. Everybody is on the make with some sort of calm, which is the main motive for speaking. That's what it sounded like to me, anyway, when I first became silent in India. So when I became celibate, then I observed everyone's sexual behavior in this way also. that for one thing, when you're celibate, then people sense this on the unconscious level. This is perceived, like vasectomy is somehow perceived, and they therefore feel safe to tell you their sexual histories. They are safe because you don't respond, and therefore you become a kind of a listening post, and you hear all this experience. And it's very reinforcing, I think, this idea on the similarity of the genders at the deepest levels. It's a great laboratory, celibacy.
But you were actually being facetious when you suggested that we need celibate rights, because I can't think of a right that's being denied celibate people.
Oh, the celibacy is insulted on a daily basis. When after in India, you can walk down the street and be nude, and it's okay. You go to the vendor and you want to buy some vegetables, if you can't point at the price or something, they'll raise your time. They're slate for you because this is understood, it's accepted. Likewise, celibacy. But in France, try being celibate in Paris. People attack. They attack, and they want to ask all these questions, like, oh, you're a vegetarian, well, do you eat eggs or not? They want to know all about it. So you say, do you masturbate? Do you this? Do you that? Do you watch when other people, to what extent? They want to know all this, and they want to attack, and as soon as they can find a way in they'll go. So
Well, maybe they're just curious.
Yes. It would help, I think it facilitates a celibacy to have a respect for that state. And I think many people would be much happier if they understood that this state was a desirable one, that it was an acceptable one. Withdrawal from any addiction has, there's a painful period, there's a difficult period. I found for sexual addiction that it took fully 6 months to become totally at ease and comfortable with celibacy. I think some people could do it much faster.
What do you make of all this, Rick?
Well, I'm listening with some amusement. I think that the ideal of androgyny is, in a sense, the liberal ideal, which in the last 20 or 30 years has attracted many people, because the idea of women's rights becoming like men has made women, as Terence pointed out, rather more androgynous than they were. They've taken on many attributes of men. Not that I think they've achieved a full functional androgyny. Most women I know are like an emulsion rather than a true synthesis. They have the male part which comes on at work and so on, and then there's a female part that comes on in other contexts. And so there's a kind of emulsion of these different aspects, often in conflict, and often creating all sorts of tensions and disturbances, like successful career women who then go into tremendous things about should they have children and how can it fit with their career and so on. It's not as if these are successfully fused for most women I've met. So I think there's been a taking over of male attributes by a lot of women, and I think that many men have had various female roles thrust upon them, or in some cases voluntarily adopted them, child rearing, housekeeping and so on. So a lot of things
are an emotion also.
I think men are an emotion also. And I think that this androgyny is, I can think of very few people who've actually achieved this state. I know lots of people who have various degrees of emulsion between these two kinds of role model or gender states. And I also think that in the role of, when we come to the expression of androgyny and bisexuality, in my own experience and among those I know, this again is not something that's kind of stable synthesis, but rather an unstable emulsion of flipping from one phase to another. And in the Western world, homosexual activities have now become identified with the gay identity of the gay community and so on. This wasn't the case 50 years ago, when the whole thing was secret anyway. And it's not the case in contemporary Islamic societies or in contemporary Hindu societies like in South India, where bisexuality is more or less a cultural norm, and it's taken for granted that there's this side of people's sexuality be expressed, particularly in youth, and maybe later in life as well. But people, because they commit homosexual acts, are not classified as gay. It's a new kind of classification. The so-called gay community has created, in my opinion, a false identity. But nevertheless, that's what happens in our society, and it means that there's not that bisexuals are wonderfully integrated androgynes, equally balanced between the two, but flipping between different modes of behaviour and communities as they do so. So I would say that the attempt to create the liberal ideal of androgyny, which was in a sense the old feminist ideal, removing gender differences as far as possible, trying to claim that little boys were interested in guns simply because they were given books that had people shooting in them, and little girls were given dolls, and that conditioned them to lifetimes of servitude in the kitchen and the home. I don't think are borne out by the facts. And I think the resurgence of the New Style women's movement and the New Style men's movement, which emphasise differences rather than similarities, is the next phase in the development. I think the androgyny phase is an experiment that's been tried and has essentially failed. It's led, as you pointed out, to the dissolution of the nuclear family without putting anything very stable in its place. It may not matter for the parents, but it does matter for the children, perhaps, much more. And I think that this attempt to rediscover traditional gender roles, myths, the goddess movement among women, is a complete turnaround from the old-style feminism, which said women are just like men and should have totally equal rights, and they're the same in every respect, except they happen to have female genitalia and breasts, and they happen to bleed every month before the menopause. That approach is now, for many women, I think, giving way to an appreciation of the sacred feminine, the goddess, the particularly feminine qualities that traditional myths around the world have emphasized. And the recent development of the men's movement in the direction of rediscovering male myths, male roles, male role models, is an attempt to rediscover a kind of validation of maleness. Now, one could say that this is simply an atavism, but I think that if you actually look at the history of sexuality, and which goes back perhaps 2 billion years, this is a point that Terence sometimes makes, that if you look in the plants and the animals, you see a very striking differentiation of male and female roles. In males, in both plants and animals, the gametes are small mobile cells, produced not just in millions but in trillions, pollen grains in plants, countless pollen grains floating around, and sperm, 5 to 10 million in every ejaculation, or however many it is. I think it's more than that, 50 million. Mm-hmm. Then the same is true of pollen grains. The ratio of 50 million to 1 is a common kind of ratio in gamete production, found throughout the entire animal kingdom, millions of species, throughout the entire plant kingdom. Every flower is a tribute to this. It may have 5, 10, 15, 20 eggs, but it may produce billions of pollen grains. So there's an essential differentiation at the level of gametes. And we see this in the development of, in all cases, the egg cells are large, few, and immobile. And in all cases, the male gametes are numerous, small, and mobile. And one could say that this kind of sexual differentiation is fundamental even at the cellular level. It goes back through millions and millions of years of evolution. It's expressed in different species differently. In most mammalian species, males are larger than females and have various differentiated roles. In birds and in fish, there's often a differentiation of gender. In some, there isn't. The greater crested grebe, for example, the males and females are extremely similar. They would represent one of the few examples in the bird realm of your ideal of androgyny, at least in terms of plumage. In some bird species, the males are particularly attractive, like peacocks. In others, the females are more attractive. It's more generally the case that males are. in the organisation of red deer troops, for example, you have a dominant stag which fights off younger stags, which has a kind of harem of females. There are many, many examples of sexual differentiation throughout the animal kingdom. We come out of millions of years, hundreds of millions of years of evolution, which has given a strong credo towards sexual differentiation, which is reinforced by the ongoing physiology of differentiation at the cellular level. This sexual differentiation of gender roles has been carried forward in all human societies. I can think of no human society I've ever heard of where androgyny has been the functional ideal. Hunter-gatherer societies, you have a division of role. Different societies divide the roles differently. I'm not saying they're all the same. But gender differentiation is one of the most fundamental features of human society, of biological organisation, of cellular organisation, of mythic structure. And the polarisation, yin-yang, plus minus, the polar structure of our own thought, which maybe Strauss points out is one of the fundamental ways that we think, is traditionally mapped onto male-female divisions, the heavens, the earth, the sky god, the earth mother, or the other way around, the earth father and the sky mother. This kind of polarity of thinking and gender differentiation is fundamental biologically, culturally, socially, mythologically. We've inherited all this through the particular versions that have come to us through European and Jewish societies. And in the last 20 or 30 years, a number of political liberals with idealistic notions about equality based on the kind of Enlightenment Bill of Rights type rhetoric have tried to rewrite the entire biological, mythological, gender, social and cultural script in a way that's manifestly a failure. And so I think that the resurgence of the men's and women's movements in the attempt to explore the older mythic archetypes have a very strong case made for it. The case for a liberal reform could be made strongly, but the way it's been made so far has been made on the most superficial political analysis based on this kind of human rights jargon, which doesn't strike very deep when one looks at the depths of the unconscious and instinctive desires of archetypal patterns, of the dark forces that work through people's psyches, especially in the sexual realm. So I myself think that that your hypothesis about androgyny, though it's undoubtedly the case that we start off, as it were, female and male characteristics in the course of embryology develop out of a basic female body structure. Men have nipples, for example, non-functional nipples. You can make a case for androgyny as having a biological root and also for a spectrum of potential within characters that can be culturally tuned and emphasized in different directions. As in Muslim societies, men in Hyderabad, where I lived, men wear wonderful perfumes and traditionally wear wonderfully colourful clothes, as 18th century men did in Europe, wonderfully colourful clothes, more elaborate than the women in many respects. These things can be culturally tuned and altered. Different ranges of potential can be brought out. But the fact is that this basic polarisation, however you read it and however it's brought out, seems pretty fundamental. And therefore, the attempt to try and create a new model of society and a new model of the family and a new kind of role model may be possible, but it's going against millions of years of morphic resonance, deep-seated creodes at the archetypal and unconscious level, and so far has been based on exceedingly superficial reasoning. So I'm not sure that it's got much of a future.
There's a sort of a parallel in a less charged area, which is the rhetoric which has surrounded the evolution of American society. When we were growing up, we were told that it was a wonderful melting pot, and that all these different kinds of people had come here, and that they would all pour their genes together, and we would create an American type. This is the analogous to the ideal of androgyny, But in fact, 50 years of experience with these large immigrant populations has brought us 180 degrees around, and now the fashionable attitude towards society is a tremendous celebration of differences, and each subgroup now retains with great tenacity its languages, its foods, its folk songs, so forth and so on. Like most complex issues, I think probably the truth lies in being able to maintain the notion of a kind of coincidentia oppositorum, that both positions, while mutually exclusive of the other, are somehow, each is magically correct. I heard someone say recently, nothing on earth is as much like a man as a woman. And in the same discussion, someone said, men and women are as different as giraffes and hummingbirds. And somehow these are both simultaneously true and not mutually exclusive.
Well, I agree that on the physical plane, as mammals, that there are tremendous differences between men and women, not only menstruation and so on, but men and women, let's say from the endocrine hormone perspective, are more different than many different animal species. And let's say that I would accept, for the sake of discussion, a factual polarity in the psyche as well, between the feminine pole and the masculine pole. That still doesn't imply that the repression of a full development would be mandatory because of the genitalia or the endocrine chemistry. When we know that there would be tribes, for example, in which the men hunted and the women cooked, and then another tribe in which the women hunted and the men cooked. So obviously, there is a phenomenon going on here. In geometry, you would call dimensional reduction. We have one binary, let's say, strong-weak, and then we have another binary, hot-cold, and they together comprise a two-dimensional space. But if there are too many dimensions, then we compress this on one dimension by identifying male with cold and female with hot or something. So the alignment of these binaries into a reduced geometrical package, I think, is a cultural function. And even though we would have a mythological tradition 6,000 years old, doesn't mean that it's not mandatory for our future to try to escape it. For example, the repression of chaos by order, the murder of Tiamat by Marduk, is 4,000 or 5,000 years old, and is actually an example of this reduction of dimension, where one binary is mapped onto another. We have the male-female, and we have the order-disorder. See, and then they're squashed in a way that doesn't make any sense. Certainly, any person will improve their development by learning to cognate disorder as well as to understand order. It's not necessary that a woman would feel more comfortable with disorder and a man would feel more comfortable with order. We have to reject that in order to fulfill our development. One effect of this, let us say, men maximizing the development of their female pole and vice versa, is in the area of empathy, which I suppose is very important in families. Even if one partner has undertook to do all the breadwinning while the other partner has accepted the role of housekeeping exclusively. So for the one to understand the other's housekeeping or the other to understand the one's work, it would be very useful to be able to empathize and to cognate and cognitively deal with these other categories.
The one that was left out is the one I'm proposing. You never lived in an extended family of your own blood relatives.
No, because my parents were dead. My brother was... I did, when I came back from India, I lived in my own hometown. for 4 or 5 years till I got married, and that was a sense rerouting myself in my ancestral territory. I mean, extended families only really work when they're coupled with being connected to the land and the traditions of the place where you were born, your native place. As soon as you have people moving hundreds of miles to get jobs or get away from their parents, and then parents moving off in America, the return of the extended family would involve the sky's dark with jumbo jets flying from Florida, bringing back all these grandparents and senior citizens who are there in their droves, and dispersing them back to where their children are. But this kind of thing, this dispersal caused by cars, mobilities, social change, starting with the Industrial Revolution and urbanization, means that the basis for this, namely geographical connection, connectedness to a place, isn't there. Well, I did try that too, but living in a small town in the English Midlands, it did indeed appeal to me. I like it. I still have a house there. But I actually tried that experiment, connecting with those members of my family who do still live there, and but it wasn't sufficiently satisfying in my case.
Well, it may be that there is no solution by going back to old models. It's important to remember that the average person 100 years ago who was 50 years old was dead, and that we must reinvent our lives at least 3 times. Most people in most traditional societies were dead at age 45 or 50, and so these problems, temporary solutions were fine because life itself had a temporary quality. You didn't have to create solutions that would last 75 years or 60 years. This is an unheard of dilemma for human beings that is very recent, and I dare say we're not doing too well with it.
Well, the fantasy of recreating a new version of extended family, this was, of course, one of the main features of the hip subculture in the 60s and the commune idea. And when that experiment failed, I felt a great loss, because that was somehow, as far as daily life is concerned, the most important aspect, and when it vanished, there was no replacement.
Why did it fail?
So I now feel that I do have an extended family. I have wonderful and close friends, and they're all over the place. Where I live, there's no one. There's my partner Ray nearby, but we're really isolated. And there have been, after I acknowledged that the telephone and the jet plane will not maintain family, I have thought many times about moving, other people moving, and somehow re-aggregating in a common geographical location, no matter if it had a creation for any of us or not. And if we were free to do this, we could actually create extended family. We would have to have enough money to buy the real estate, put the houses and so on, where we could essentially create our own village, voluntary communities. And this would require even a greater level of mobility than we even have now, because we are too bound where we are to even do this. So life is passing, the years are going on, and the dream of having an extended family is receding farther and farther as no one has been able to organize one.
Maybe this explains the remarkable attraction that computer networking has for some people, that it's an incipient virtual extended family and could be made more explicitly real if this were raised into consciousness.
Really explicitly real, and you found that your needs for community was completely satisfied in this way. When you came finally to parent, if you were a woman and you're going to have one child, you still find no way to do it. You have no family support for the actual parenting that goes in a room or two in a house somewhere. Your family is too far away. So I came to the conclusion that old-fashioned, antique, geographical proximity is the only way to have real family.
And real community.
Yes.
And there's a very good analysis by Wendell Berry in one of his essays about the way in which the modern cash economy has grown up precisely through fragmentation of those things that are most important to human beings, namely the sense of community, family, closeness of connection to nearest and dearest. As soon as you begin to fragment communities, people still have those needs. So in order to re-establish them, they need telephones, cars, jet planes, the travel business, and they now have to spend billions of dollars, hundreds of billions in aggregate, to do what were done free before, namely meeting neighbours on the street and talking to friends. So this fragmentation, he argues, is the very basis of modern cash capitalist society, is precisely based on fragmenting the things which are dearest and most important to us, because then to recover the pieces, to try and put them back together again, we have to travel hundreds of miles, spend a lot of money on jet, burn lots of gasoline, travel hundreds of miles on highways, to recover just momentarily, for brief periods, the things which are the common birthright of most people in most parts
So this is
of the
part
world.
of the factor of 800 to 1,000.
Yes, it's very closely related to the high consumption patterns, because what most people want most of the time are these things of nearness, closeness, friends, talking to people, chats, being in groups where you feel at home, at ease among friends. Now to do it, you have to earn lots of money, and then you have to drive a long way along Highway 1, spending lots of money on gasoline, polluting the atmosphere, to come to Esalen for a weekend, so you can get that feeling of togetherness in a group and sense of time, and then disperse again, and then earn more money so you can come back again.
So in future our society's got to abandon mobility. It's a failed experiment.
Well, we are in the act of doing that. Maybe we're over the hump. It sounds like it was the automobile that destroyed all this, and perhaps the new electronic technologies, of which it is always said they are shrinking the world, they are knitting us all together into one, are in fact overcoming the dispersion which took place under the aegis of the mechanical technologies of steam and petrol.
Well, it's fine to blame the automobile or the train, but I think actually we have an addiction to travel. We love it. We love to get on the plane and go somewhere far away and have an experience which we later describe as very illuminating and developmental.
God, we complain about it constantly.
Well, we don't need to do it. You see, traditionally, in a village or somewhere, you can have the experience of the other or the new by going on foot for a day.
So I agree it's unnecessary, but I think that now we're in a state of addiction, so in order to recover, to abandon mobility, we're going to have to kind of use a 12-step program, not just blame the automobile or the Industrial Revolution. I first of all volunteered to go to college some 1,000 miles away from home when there were excellent colleges nearby. My father was extremely angry about this. He knew this was wrong, and that was just one step as he thought to going even further, and that's true. Then I took my first job. It was in California, another couple 1,000 miles farther from home, and here I am still flying to Vermont once a year to replenish my family relations.
But if we assume that these electronic technologies are going to continue along this line of obliterating time and space, then it's reasonable to assume that in a generation or so this is going to lose its force, and that if you want to see Mom will be there in her virtual totality.
It work properly.
It won't work, because we've been hearing for decades now, at least 10, 20 years, how telephones and computers and all this, well, you can work anywhere, you can be a stockbroker living in the depths of the country. Yet, in London, still, the city of London is full of commuter trains coming in the mornings. All the stockbrokers still work there. They don't work in the depths of the country. Businessmen can communicate by fax, computer, telephone, anywhere in the world, yet jet planes are full of businessmen going to meetings around the world.
Well, but that's only half of it. I mean, I live in a rural area, and I'm surrounded by stockbrokers and screenwriters and the executives of major corporations, and they are in fact they rarely go to the office, and they are realizing this dream of diffuse, the obliteration of the town-country distinction.
Well,
it's happening.
Why do you live in London? Why not stay in Newark?
Well, in my own case, I'd rather stay in Newark. Joe likes living in London.
Well, see,
But it's completely
outside the
unnecessary.
village. That's one thing that
Yes.
is mobility.
That's traditionally one advantage of London as opposed to the country is that I hate cars, you see, and so I don't have one. Phil has one. I hardly ever drive. Living in London, I can walk now into school, I can walk to the shops, I take public transport to where I go. Everyone I know who lives in the country to get into rural simplicity, in fact, spends most of their life in a car. I spend probably an hour a week in a car at home, if that. And so rural simplicity, as I actually see it among my friends, in fact means total dependence on mechanized
Mobility.
transport. And people who live in villages in the country in England have to drive their kids to school, they have to drive them to play with friends and so on. In London, or any town, if you live in any town of the European kind, rather than a sprawling suburb predicated on a car, in traditional, ours is a Victorian area, the whole thing was built on the assumption that everyone will primarily be moving around on foot. So we're able, at least in England, to live in cities where you've got the old type of planning, which is based on foot transport together with trains and public transport. You can get by fine like that. So that for me is a good reason for living in a city. Lower energy consumption, less time spent dependent on mechanized transport. So I think that there's a sense in which living in the country is one of these illusions of closeness to nature, which is in partly true.
Living in a village, like I haven't been to Newark, but in a village you can live in the village as opposed to in the countryside 10 miles outside of the village.
Yes, I think living in a rural
and then you
community.
can go around on foot doing most things if you don't need spare parts for your computer or something. So most of the time you could do that. You could walk to the train station if you needed to go to London.
Yes.
So wouldn't that be an alternative?
Well, it would,
And
yes,
maybe a
except
sense of place.
one of the problems with villages in most of England is that because increasing numbers of people have cars, and because there's less and less employment within villages, because agriculture has now become mechanized agribusiness, whereas the whole village would have been based on agriculture. Now you've got two farmers who own all the farmland and do it with one assistant each. The rest of the population of the village are either commuters or retired people, which means that there's no longer a kind of base of people who live and work in the village, and therefore
Even
very
village
few
shops are closing down.
very few young children. Schools, shops have closed down in a lot
So
of
villages are dying, in short.
Villages are becoming commuter suburbs, dormitories.
But I think there's just a lag here in implementing available technology. In 15 years, I'll bet these villages aren't dying. Most of those commuters will be working at their keyboards,
Yes.
and
Well,
the flow of population movement will have changed. Those English villages will be tremendously desirable, like the small towns of Northern California. Just in the time I've been living up there, I've seen them go from dying communities based on apple growing and wine to Mercedes ghettos inhabited by stockbrokers and computer programmers who do all their work over the telephone lines.
Well, not all. I bet you they travel. Everyone I know who lives in remote areas spends a fortune on travelling. They still have to go to meetings in New York, San Francisco, London, etc., and spend enormous amount of time travelling.
But I think this is, again, it's that they don't actually need to. It's that the companies they work for have not grown up with the available technologies. Most meetings could be handled electronically. It's simply, for instance, we all work for Bertelsmann, the largest publisher in the world, and apparently they're still doing most of their work on battered Underwoods. When, this is laughable. So it isn't that there aren't solutions, it's that there's a perverse resistance to the available solution.
All right, so one way of recovering some sense of the extended family is to have locally based communities.
Yes.
Reduced mobility.
Thanks to the computer revolution, that telecommuting does enable a mass diffusion from cities back to villages that seems to be well underway in California. So that's some hopeful note.
My publishers in New York insist that I come to New York at least once a year to talk to them, and it's all, we have lunch, and we say the same things we've said the week before on the telephone, and then they're satisfied. But it's just a ritual. It has no, there's no raison d'etre for it at all, except to reassure them.
There's something about physical proximity, maybe the exchange of pheromones, maybe the coupling of local morphic fields or something, body fields, auras. There's something about it which the electronic revolution hasn't yet replaced. And that's why I think all these businessmen are jetting around the world to meetings. They could do most of it by fax or teleconferencing. The fact is that these things haven't, for most people, yet worked, and it's because there's some need they don't satisfy. When I went to visit the Xerox Corporation headquarters last year, I gave a talk to them on morphic resonance, both in Silicon Valley and in their Cambridge Research Centre in England. They're seriously concerned with this. They think they're seriously concerned that all these potentials of the computer and telecommunication revolution haven't in fact materialized to anything like the extent people were predicting a decade ago. And so they've now hired psychologists from universities to look into what is it in social interaction which is important to people, including subconscious clues. And what they've done now is it's laughable, really. And in the centre in Cambridge, they have in every office, they have a video camera, and they have a screen, and you can see everybody in all the different offices by flicking a knob. You can see everybody else, so when you're talking to them you can have them on the screen, but you can also watch what they're doing. But so that it doesn't invade people's privacy too much, whenever anyone has you on the screen, or you're about to come on their screen, you hear a noise like a creaking door, which indicates someone's looking at you, and then you can see who it is. And so they tried, and then they found that most people's most meaningful and constructive and creative interactions happened around the coffee machine, when they actually met physically almost by chance. So they've created a kind of virtual coffee machine space on this thing, where people can meet, as it were, by chance, as a kind of virtual coffee machine. So they're trying to do this, but it's so laborious, so artificial, and so pathetic, that you can see what they're trying to do. They're trying to address this question. At least they've realized there's some appalling deficiency in this kind of communication that leaves most people deeply unsatisfied. There's something about physical proximity that hasn't been substituted. This visual thing is a step to make it more so, but even that is clearly unsatisfying. And still, most people, with all these expensive gadgets, do most of their talking by the real coffee machine.
Yes, well, I personally urgently long for a real village. I don't even know one to move to. And a real village with my friends in it, and I think my life will be unfulfilled if this is never achieved. And not only I wish it for myself, but for the whole planet, the reversal of the trend of dying villages and growing cities.
Well, you must move to Occidental, Ralph. We'd love to have you.
Yes, or Hampstead.
Yes.
You're right. It gives me great satisfaction to know everyone in that town and have a first name exchange with the girl who bags my groceries and the guy who pumps my gas and so forth. I don't think that's an unrealizable dream for you at all.
It's not even unrealizable in cities. If you look at traditional cities like Siena in Italy, traditional medieval cities are based on a whole series of neighborhoods. And you get this also in Indian cities. You have bastis, which are like villages within the city. They're villages where everyone knows everyone. There's the local shopkeeper, the local potter, and local this and local that. And so the traditional model of city life is of tight-knit communities which have the qualities of a village. Hampstead in London, it's called Hampstead Village, and has something of that quality. I know most of my neighbours, say hello to the people in the shops, they know me, conversation. See the same people year after year. This does happen.
Village in New York is called.
Yes, when I stay with people there.
It was a real busty.
It still is. I'm amazed when I stay with my friend in Greenwich Village and we go out for coffee. To me, it's this teeming city of millions of people. I wouldn't expect to ever encounter anyone I know. And his entire experience is of greeting people, inquiring how their business and health is going, and he knows who these people are. And he's only lived there 4 or 5 years, so there is... people do create community even in the most visually unlikely environments.
And they try to do it even in suburbs. You see, I think the suburb represents the attempt to create a community which is a village, but actually it's neither town nor country.
Right.
It's a failure.
It's a failure, but that is predicated on the car, and we can blame the car for the sprawling suburbs, which then, in order for people to get anywhere or do anything, they have to use their cars, go to shopping now, take kids to school, that kind of thing. So the traditional model of cities and the traditional model of villages both have this local community as a key feature of them, which provides some of the qualities of the extended family. And usually the extended family lived in the local community, so it was part of
So is what we're concluding that to overcome the alienation between the genders, it's a technological and demographic
civic
problem.
planning and demographics, and we need a kind of a 12-step program to escape our addiction to mobility, to minimize it. I mean, once a year to cross the country to see everybody you know there is certainly acceptable. And perhaps this is already happening, and Wendell Berry and people like this revisioning the structure of entire nations.
Well, Esalen is a village, and
Esalen is a resort.
But there is a large, seemingly stable population. I mean, I know more people per square foot of Esalen than anywhere else on earth that I recognize. I've been coming here so long. It's hard for me to convince myself that there's a large throughput of people because there always seem to be the same people.
After villages are reinstated and people give up mobility and our village becomes our extended family, I have a fear that there is still some problem about how to organize co-parenting and partnership of the genders within households that we have not solved.
Well, the question that's a really interesting one now is whether the revival, and we've tried androgyny, it's been tried by many people and it's worked up to a point, but it, as you point out, it's been associated with, in fact, the demise of the nuclear family in the sense that most marriages now end in divorce in certain parts of the world, like here. In Britain, I think it's 45% of marriages end in divorce. I think in the United States it's about 52% or something. In other parts of Europe it's less. Britain's the highest in Europe, the closest to America. So the old model is obviously crumbling, and this androgyny hasn't saved it. In fact, it may have made it worse. So now we have the question of, do these new rediscoveries of male and female myths, a process only been going on some 10 years, and in the case of the men's movement only 2 or 3 years, and in fact only in the last year has it reached sort of mainstream consciousness. Is this process likely to meet with more success in stabilizing gender relationships? The androgynous model creating a kind of fluctuating emulsion of roles with no role models or no sense of identity or no norms. Can that give way to a new model that's somehow related to much more ancient mythic patterns? That's the experiment that's currently being tried. No one knows how it will turn out, but it's a new experiment, and it's because the consciousness of in this new form of post-feminist male roles and so on is something only just developing. So what would you rate its chances of success, Ralph? Probably low, given your preference for the liberal androgynous model.
No, I think that people will accept rather than deny the observed term of marriage. They will, upon deciding to have a child, make a sort of premarital agreement, as it were, with clauses in the contract as to where the child will go and what will happen in case of a separation. That among these agreements might be an agreement to stay in the same village. This would be one of the main stabilizing forces for villages in future. Now the tendency is, after the dissolution of a marriage, that the partners move to different villages because they don't want to see each other. So that would be, I think, a stabilizing thing, the acceptance rather than the denial of the shorter-term marriage, the provision of conditions that would preserve the extended family even when the nuclear family disintegrates, not moving too far. Then the children would be able to walk back and forth between different parents' households, with other friends, nephews, relatives, and close people, and so on, all within walking distance in the village. And maybe this is a kind of a negative view, but I like this. I never accepted the marriage institution in my life as something fundamentally correct. So in this context, with the extended family secure and the pressures released from the nuclear family, I think people could join for a short time in parenting, understanding if it became very uncomfortable to live in the same house, they just live in different houses, and the impact on the children of such separation would be much smaller. This would be an increased mobility on the village scale.
And if this were going on simultaneously with what we discussed last night, a much greater commitment to have only one child, the psychological stress and the financial demands on all parties, I think it would all feed together into a somewhat happier situation.
People wouldn't need to adopt a lot of children from developing nations or something, because in the extended family, the children run around in tribes, and there are cooperative child care, for example. That means that 12 children come to this house for one day, and then the next day they're in another house. So people would have adequate contact with people of all ages, having their lives enriched in that way in the extended family.
Yes, well, this is certainly one way of looking, one perhaps step. But what about the next thing related to roles and genders? Is this the revival of the interest in rites of passage for boys and for girls? You know, the coming into one's own gender through a traditional initiation or rite of passage. And I think that a very strong case can be made for the need for these initiations and rites of passage. Now, it may be that traditional rites of passage, they've died out for the large part. Now, they're being revived by men's and women's groups based on traditional mythic models. If you wanted to have the androgyne as the model, then there'd have to be an appropriate androgyne rite of passage, so a child or a young person could be inducted into the state of androgyny. I'm not quite sure what form that would take.
By simply not making a distinction between the initiation of boys and girls, you initiate adolescence, period.
I suppose this is something like the metamorphosis of a butterfly. That we have, as we envision it at the moment, a world civilization in phase transition. In order to end up with a stable outcome with some chance in the future, we need to have many options. So even in villages, there might be initiatory experiences offered of different sorts and different traditions, and parents or committees in the extended family make a decision on, or the child himself, herself, would make a decision as to which of several different kinds of initiatory experiences, like what kind of summer camp to go to. You can go to music camp, or the Native American camp, or the physical culture camp and so on.
Or the bisexual androgyne camp. I can't see many parents signing up their kids.
New traditions, myths, and so on of greater validity than old forms could conceivably evolve. I don't think it's going to work to choose initiatory rites from an encyclopedia of different rituals that were successful in Sumer or Babylonia or Native Americans, Aborigines, and so on. They all have faults, but they all have contributed to our arrival in this particular conundrum that we are suffering now.
So we seem to have gotten the children taken care of and the society taken care of, but we didn't make a whole lot of progress on the apparently eternal differences between sexually active adult men and women.
Well,
that was the part we shied off from.
Because I think that we did. Maybe I didn't make this clear. My proposal is that people will have voluntary monogamies if they wish. They'll understand to the beginning, whenever that ends for one partner or the other, then there would be a rejection, there would be a dissolution of the voluntary monogamy, and the suffering, jealousy, or whatever that falls upon the other partner who didn't want to stop, that this would be mitigated by therapies and rituals and practices within the extended family, which have to be evolved in order to accept this. And I think that this is, I mean, what else could have been the situation in tribal societies throughout our million years of development?
Well, what else was the situation, and is the situation in many parts of the world, is that it's not expected of men that they should be sexually faithful. And in many parts of the world, including Victorian England, or contemporary Italy, or certainly many parts of India, Thailand, and elsewhere, it's taken for granted that they'll have, if not mistresses, at least visits to prostitutes or brothels. I mean, these are ancient institutions, and they've been sustained through the millennia by the custom of men. And many of these men are married men, and wives have, there's been the well-known double standard in matters of sexual fidelity, which perhaps has corresponded more to physiological needs and psychological urges, a differentiation of these in the sexes. At any rate, the idea of monogamy for men is a recent invention. It's, in fact, I think, an invention idealized by the women's movement. It was women put up with or accepted infidelity on the part of the men, and yet remain married to them.
But it goes against Ralph's intuition that gender differences are not that important, and it has to make its peace with the modern epidemiological situation.
Well, I think that this is, we've arrived at an important point, and I'm glad we didn't quit before getting here, because this idea of the artificiality of male monogamy, of course, has to be applied symmetrically. And the monogamy of women, the fidelity of women, is an aspect of the patrilineal law, where in order for the property to pass from the father to the firstborn son, for example, is essential to know who actually is the father of the son. And for that reason primarily, I think, was invented the law for the monogamy or the fidelity of women. We have to give that up. We have to give up the patrilineal law in order to have any kind of stable society, I think, in which men or women change sexual partners whenever they wish.
I think it goes deeper than that, because if you look at the homosexual community and assume that among male homosexuals behavior is going on completely without influence by the values of women, and that among lesbians behavior is ordered completely without regard to the values of men, you see that the sexual behavior of male homosexuals is vastly different than the sexual behavior of female homosexuals. Gay men have hundreds, sometimes thousands of partners, and this is not thought much of in a lifetime, where lesbians nest. They do not maximize sexual contact in the same way.
Yes, I think that's a strong point, and I think that these traditional differentiations of sexual roles in societies can be seen as reflecting it. I know from the point of view of modern feminist rhetoric that these are all appalling oppressions, these are roles imposed on women and so on, and I'm sure there's some truth in that. But male monogamy is, in fact, quite a recent invention. It's not expected in most societies I've heard of, even in biblical societies. You know, what's held up to us is the very model of, the Bible's full of stories of harlots and kings who had concubines and so on. It just wasn't the norm, even of the most sacred books of our religious tradition. And I think it's a kind of idealization that's come about quite recently. In the 18th century European society, it certainly wasn't the norm.
Well, right
Or
now, let me try
expected.
to get this clear. In our model village of the future, men will not be expected to have contract of monogamy. Fine, but are you thinking then that women will volunteer for a faithful relationship with a man who's not in the reciprocal agreement of monogamy?
Well, less so than ever before, probably, because of the AIDS question. But one of the things, the point I was trying to make was that the invention of the nuclear family with male monogamy is in fact a very recent institution. Not just the nuclear family, but the ideal of male monogamy may have existed for quite a long time. The practice of it has existed a lot
It
less.
probably arose with the nuclear family, post-industrial revolution.
So we're dealing, it's just simply amplifying an earlier point, that the ideals associated with the nuclear family, and together with the feminist-based ideal of completely reciprocal 50-50 relationships of all kinds, are based on a kind of legalistic approach to the problem, which may not correspond to deeper and unconscious habitual patterns. I'm not saying the habitual patterns are right and that this legalist approach is wrong, but I think that the attempt to apply these liberal legalistic models has failed again and again in relation to marriage, it's failed in relation to racial integration, it's failed in relation to communities, the behaviour of nations and so on.
Well, what I would imagine is that if a woman decides, let us say, to have one child, and she decides it's the time and so on, and then she may very well sleep with all the men in the village, or more likely she might choose a parent. She might choose a father for the child, and having that in mind, that choice, she would then become monogamous at least until she had the child. And then there would be between them, I suppose, some kind of contract or agreement as to what would, maybe a tacit agreement, what would happen in case they separated. And most likely that would be that the child stays with the mother. And maybe in exceptional cases they agree that upon separation the child will go with the father. Whatever agreement is made, if the child is 4, 5, 6 years old, the child may actually influence modification of this agreement and go with the other parent or something. Anyway, in this situation it is not important. I mean, patrilineal law is abandoned, and monogamy or sexual freedom would just be a choice of the individual no matter what gender. And I think that this seems like a much better situation than we have today, and it could be stable. What would that mean, though, in terms of our actual lives? We have what seems to be the usual experience is that you get in relationship with someone that becomes very intense in comparison with the relationship of other people around. You are sort of on a trip, as they say. And one thing that may happen is kind of a voluntary monogamy, if Wilhelm Reich is right, as I have experienced, that this natural state does fall upon people. And then you're in a situation which we have not exactly provided for in our model village of the future. And in case this voluntary monogamy then ends, there's a difficult situation that somehow has to be dealt with therapeutically.
More jobs for therapists.
What a depressing conclusion.
Grandmothers and grandfathers may be the most experienced and successful therapists in the extended family.
No, well then,
grandparents do this therapy job.
Well, then we've got to evacuate Florida first.
Yes.
Bring them all back.
Or I'll move there.
Well, no, I think there's just a tiny footnote to the village thing. Instead of having old people funneled off to the retirement communities in Florida, then each model village should have maybe some, like almshouses in traditional English times.
Yes.
Small colonies of retired parents who fulfill some kind of child-minding grandparenting role. And I would imagine it would be much more attractive if one were retiring, going away from where one spent on Cleveland, Ohio or something, instead of going to an old folks ghetto in Florida, to go to there are just 4 or 5 vacancies come up every 2 or 3 years in Occidental California. You can go to one of those. There's a limited number, not enough to create a ghetto, and a way in which these are integrated into the community. This would be a major step forward, I think.
Yes, well, I think retirement in our future village would be an insignificant event, because one would not vacate the house or go anywhere. People requiring an exceptional amount of nursing care would go to special houses just 2-3 blocks away where this kind of care was available. The integrity of the extended family would then be preserved, and the only exit really would be death.
So as the king said to Mozart, there you have it.
Okay, much time.
We solved all the problems.
All the problems taken care of.
Society with original solutions.